Thank you very much, Purnima, and thank you for your kind words. And thanks to Professor Nandakumar and Ambassador Sanjay Singh, my colleague Dr. Samina, my old associate Manish in the Manipal Institute, and Professor Arvind Kumar, and other friends and colleagues. One of the problems of speaking in the end is that everybody has spoken whatever I wanted to say. So at one level, it is a good news because you don't have to say anything new. But at the same time, since you cannot simply repeat everything people said, you have to say something different. What I'm trying to do is I'm going to put about 4 simple points from what we have been hearing for the last 1.5 hours. And that will give you an idea about the implications of this accord for Israel. First and foremost, it tells you the larger foreign policy agenda of Israel. If you are familiar with, from 1948 till today, ending the political and economic isolation has been the core foreign policy agenda of Israel. You know, if you look at any other country in the world, if you are a newly born country, you want everybody to recognize you. But the 3rd or 4th year, most important countries would have recognized, you would have closed the file. But if you look at Israel, even 70 years later, you still have a sizable number of countries which have not recognized Israel's right to exist. So if you look at the Emirati, Bahraini or Sudan, the fundamental issue is these countries recognize Israel's right to exist. And the second thing is, in achieving this, Israel was able to exploit the opportunities. These countries are afraid of Iran. Some of them are even afraid of Turkey. And their design of these countries, Israel is able to exploit it to his advantage. And suddenly, Emirate recognizes, I don't have a problem with the Jewish state. And if you look at it, this was the case from 1971, ever since the Emirate was established. There's nothing new. The same story with Sudan. Sudan is an existed from 1950. So Israel and Sudan never had a problem. Israel and Bahrain never had a problem. But why these countries took such a lot of time? That is where your department, the geopolitics, comes into play. And what you notice is suddenly Emirate and Bahrain are concerned more about Iran, less about Israel. And that is what it is. The changing regional dynamics, Israel began to exploit it. Because if you look at Samina mentioned about the Mediterranean gas pipeline, if you look at what is interesting thing, there are about 7 countries in the region. And you know, there is a forum have all these countries, including Italy. One country which is missing is Turkey. Because all these countries have some sort of a problem with Turkey. And Israel said, even Palestinians are there. The Palestinian Authority is there, and Israel is there, Cyprus is there, Greece is there, Egypt is there, but not Turkey. So if you look at it, the foreign policy, you know, in the sense, you can never have an ideal foreign policy. Foreign policy basically means, given the ground realities, how do you maximize your interests? And this is where Trump comes into picture. You and I may have a different opinion about Trump. Probably if Trump stands in front of a mirror, he may also come with a different opinion. But the issue is, Trump has emerged as the most pro-Israeli president Israel had ever seen. In a number of sense, he is more pro-Israeli than Netanyahu himself. Whether it's a question of Jerusalem, whether it's a question of Golan Heights, whether it's a question of annexation or settlements, his positions are right of Netanyahu. And therefore, Israel is able to exploit. And what did Israel promise to Emirate? To satisfy the Palestinians, it says we are deferring the annexation. And if you are familiar with Israeli politics, annexation was not the first priority of Netanyahu. Netanyahu talked about annexation only when he did not get a simple majority in the election. So in the third election, he simply said, let's have an annexation. The second point is, a large number of people are suggesting, scholars, the normalization indicates the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict. This is a narrative. I'm not so sure about it, but this is what people are presenting it. What they are saying is, to take on from what Mudassar has said, the Arab-Israeli conflict is now reduced to Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That is, it is a conflict between two neighbors. To put it very crudely, it's like Indo-Pakistan conflict. You sort it out. It's not my issue. I think that is the kind of thing we have got. As Mudassar was saying, we did not reach here overnight. If we got there over a period of time, we did not recognize that. I would submit with all my humility that the first country to recognize this, that is, you can no longer play the Palestinian card in your relations with the Arab world, was India. India was the first country to recognize you can no longer promote your interests in the Middle East by playing up the Palestinian card. That is, Palestinian cause is no longer a currency of influence. That was in '92. And today, Emirates says the same thing. I support the Palestinians, but I'm not going to make the Palestinian cause as a precondition for normalizing relations with Israel. That is what it is. And if Sudan joins, the same story. And Sudan has a personal angle. IL-76, probably Falcon. So if you look at it, in 1967, the Khartoum summit came out with a resolution, 3 no's. No recognition, no negotiation, no peace with Israel. And yesterday, what is Sudan says? And that's what Netanyahu said. What is Sudan? Sudan says, yes, yes, yes. Instead of 3 no, now we are saying 3 yes. It's a full circle. So the Israelis see it as an end of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is not factually correct. But what will happen is, it will considerably reduce the Palestinian leverage in the negotiations. Israelis can live with it. They can live with the problem. That is what you're probably getting to the idea. I'm not so sure. Probably you can live with the problem maybe another 11 days. If Biden comes, you have a different dynamics. So we will come to that. The third thing is, if you look at the international write-ups, on the 15th of September and the 16th of September, dozens of articles have come. The significance of this, when did it begin, what are the implications, all of them. All the think tanks in the world and every scholars in India, every media people have written about it. Suddenly, everyone is an Israeli expert. That's a good news, actually, more the merrier. But when you look at the Israeli press, it didn't figure prominently. The most prominent agenda for them was COVID. And if you look at it, when Netanyahu signed the agreement in Washington, some of them actually said, stay there, don't come. That was the position. If you look at it, in the domestic Israeli politics, the impact of normalization is not very considerable. People are not talking about that. So that we need to look at it. And the final point is that historical. Is it historical? In a way, yes. In a way, no. If you look at the Egyptian and the Jordanian peace with Israel, they were very prolonged. They demanded certain concessions from Israel in terms of territorial giving up. Sinai Peninsula in case of Egypt, and similarly certain more partial concessions along the Jordan Valley. But if you look at in the Emirati and the Gulf normalization, Israel did not do any price. It did not pay any price. It was relatively simpler. Therefore, to say it historical would be a little problematic. But it is also historical in the sense the floodgates will open now. So talking to Israel, dealing with Israel, visiting Israel, issuing a visa to Israel is a very normal thing. It's no longer a special. Therefore, what is, the domestic population which is not excited by normalization in Israel will be attracted by what Samin Ahmed said about the economic component. And what you're going to see is unbelievable. There is going to be trade, investment, partnership, scientific collaborations, innovations, and you can even talk about high tech. And we are familiar with that. Israel and the Emirates are almost on the same plane when it comes to efficiency. And my personal thing will be India will be a big loser in the normalization process. For the simple reason, efficiency is not part of our DNA. This is part of an Israeli DNA. This is part of the Emirati DNA. And therefore, if you look at it in terms of investment, innovation, scientific, academic, technological collaboration, Emirate and Israel is going to be the leaders. And we will actually simply stand and clap. One final word. Since, when before the session began, I saw Vivekananda's picture behind our friend Nandakishore's table. Vivekananda says, success is a bad teacher. It is insult, humiliation, and defeat. They teach us better in life. So if you are a Palestinian, the normalization is the worst thing you could have got. And therefore, this gives you an opportunity to ask a question, where did I go wrong? Because only then you will, because this would be what I would call an enlightened moment. If a normalization did not teach you, nothing will teach you, you don't deserve a state. Because if you look at it, you are at the Nadir, a country which you thought is a great friend, now one after the other is abandoning you. Rather than abusing everybody, you simply sit down and ask, where did I go wrong? So in that sense, I would say that the normalization, I'm telling in the negative sense, is the greatest thing happened to the Palestinian for an honest reflection. I think I'll stop at this point of time. Let's open the question answer. Thank you very much.